Morning. Really?
Good morning.
Thank you. This might be a little different. I have fewer words in all my slides than were on his last slide. So this is a typical slide for me. I will be talking a lot about what I've gained from working in iOS and mobile, but years ago I moved from mathematics to Java world. I was covering Java on the Mac in about 1997 and spent quite a long time in Java. It sort of led to me being called in to help write the Java 2 Bible, which was just a blast. And then we launched Java.net. And I think of that because we launched it 11 years ago today. It's not like I remember this, but it's my mom's birthday too. And we did this working for O'Reilly. Son sort of hired O'Reilly to come over and launch this. And at the same time, do you guys remember this site? Are you all young? Probably are. When we went to launch Java.net, that was when they introduced that coffee cup logo. And it was a secret even from us. We weren't allowed to see it, so they had just a little gray panel in the top corner of our site the night before we launched. And so June 9th, we didn't know what our site was going to look like because Sun wouldn't show it to us until a friend of ours walked down the street to Java 1, and they had banners everywhere with the logo, and he took a picture of it and sent it to us. So we knew what the site would look like. Java.net was all about community. And Ted talked yesterday about the difference between developers and managers and how they like different things. I think we like people. I think we like talking to people. Now, we love to code. We love to sit face down in our code. But what I'm going to talk about today is the code that we write is all about the people that we write it for. And the more that we're connected to the people that we're writing it for and we're thinking about them, the better the apps it will produce. Now, in particular, I'll be thinking about things that I've learned working with iPhone code, but it applies pretty generally across the years. And so I look back at the first app that we built when we come to the iPhone, and the first app that most of us built was the classic Hello World, and it looked something like this. Isn't that awesome? You press the button and it says Hello World. Now, we had to update this in the last year because iOS 7 shipped and they changed our UI, so buttons don't look anything the same. So if you were doing this today, it would look more like this, and that's a huge improvement. Really, the first thing you build on iOS is you open up Xcode, you build a new project, and you get something like this. Just a blank slate. But somebody on day one of the App Store looked at this and said, I can sell this. And he called it a flashlight, and he made $10,000 the first week. So that was the early days of the App Store, and in the old days of the App Store, it was like this. You could find apps because there just weren't that many of them. People could find your app. Now the App Store looks like this. Good luck, people, finding what you're working on. So what we build, we have to really think about how do we make it stand out. The same is true in any space you're in. How do you get your app to stand out? How do you get people to notice? So if I'm building a flashlight, maybe I look around at all the flashlights out there and I think, well, what features should I add? Well, when you think about what features to add, of course, you look to Microsoft because they have charts like this all the time. I can move you to the Pro version. And so when you ask which features to add, it's kind of easy, right? You gotta sell flashlights. Anybody know who this is? Bootsy Collins. Who said that? Very good. So it's actually relevant. It's relevant to both the flashlights and to development. A friend of mine, I'm going to tell a lot of radio stories today. I put myself through grad school working as a DJ and a newscaster, and we played people like Bootsy. One of my program directors, his young daughter said this at a recent concert of his. Bootsy Collins produced this album that I brought with me to college. I'm old enough that I had records. They're like 12 inches, and you played them on a record player. But before this, he played with other people and wrote other songs, and here's one of them. Of course, that's Flashlight. Before he played with Parliament Funkadelics or went out on his own, he worked with James Brown for a while. And he said one of the things that he learned from James Brown was that what he was doing was 70% business and 30% music. And it made him think very differently about it. For him, it had all been about music, but James Brown ran a very tight business. And when we think about business, I mean, it kind of bums us out, you know? People tell us, well, I know you want to do it that way, but that costs too much. I got a ship date. I got a conference coming up. There's all these reasons that we can't do it right. But to us, it's all about the music. That's why we build the apps that we build. We think about our audience. They aren't just people that use our apps. They aren't just people that use our software. They just don't spend money on us. They're fans. This is my youngest daughter with her Bootsy Collins glasses. That's Elena. These are the people that we build our software for. You got to pay attention to the business, but the whole idea is to delight your audience. And this is what delight looks like. This is what people should feel like when they're using your software. So you guys know who Ron Jeffries is? Ron Jeffries got this email challenge that said, yeah, all these ideas are great, but that's not how it works in the real world. You know, in the real world, these things don't apply. And Ron's answer was, wait a minute, that's our job. We create this real world that we work in. If these things don't work in the real world, then maybe we should change that world to be the world that we want to live in. And that's what we get to do. If only this were the whole truth. The rest of that truth is that it can be very subtle. So here's an example from iPhone. Here's a developer who has given us a text input field and they haven't configured it for email input. And so to type in an email address, I have to go from the alphabetic and I have to switch keyboards to get the @ sign, and I have to switch back to alphabet, then I have to switch over here to get the dot, and it's not the dot that we want. They haven't taken the time to think about things, and so our users aren't enjoying our software because we haven't taken that time to think in terms of the people using it. You can do all this work and no one notices. So here's a page from a recent book that I've written. It's on iPhone programming. It's the Stanford book. It's free. I wouldn't sit here and plug a book that wasn't free. Here's one page. Now, my sister was my editor at Java World magazine, and I've used other editors between then and now, but I've gone back to her for my books because she's an outstanding editor. Here are her comments for this one page. That's how many corrections she had me do. As good as we are, we need other eyes on it. Here's the type of images that I produce without the supervision of a designer. And here's what a designer does. Subtle. You should see the colors I use when she's not looking. She corrects me pretty quickly. You're going to do a lot of work. No one's going to see it. So I said I worked in radio. Anybody know what this is? It's an old teletype machine. And so when I used to work as a newscaster, I would go in at 4:30 in the morning, and I'd tear off the news from the day before, and I'd organize it into sections, and I'd start organizing my news. And then I would go out because about then we get a delivery. A lot of people don't recognize these anymore. These are newspapers. And so I would read through 2 newspapers, and I'd do all that work with the newspapers and the teletype to produce 108 seconds of news. Why 108 seconds? Because we were FM 108. Should be obvious. Less than 2 minutes of news, starting at 4:30 in the morning, twice an hour. So, when I first got married, the first thing my wife did was food poison me. And it was pretty clever. She cooked fish and she didn't think it was cooked enough, so she put her portion back in the microwave. The second thing she did was when I got my PhD, she said, you should go to cooking school, and she sent me to cooking school. And what you learn when you cook professionally is that it's all preparation, that the magic happens before you go to the stove. I was at a restaurant here last night in an open kitchen watching the chef work, and he was just so far ahead. Everything was so clean that when an order came in, it was almost easy for him. He had everything ready. So we have this radio show in the United States that's syndicated. You can get the podcast here. It's called This American Life. And what they do each week is they produce maybe 3 or 4 stories. But to get there, they put out a call for stories, and they get about 25 submissions. And of those 25 submissions, they narrow it down to about 10 that they're interested in. And they hire people to go out and do recordings and build these stories. And so they've gone from 25 to 10. And then of those 10, a half to a third of what they try in those 10 stories actually make it to the air. They've started, and they've weeded out, and they've weeded out. They've done the work. You compare that to Cocoa iOS podcasts, developer podcasts. For a 1-hour podcast, how much recording have they done? Probably 59 minutes, and then they put in a theme song. They don't eliminate anything. It's what you throw away that makes what you do best. So, I'm building a flashlight. And I think, where do I start? And what I start with are these 3 questions. What am I building? For whom am I building it? And why? These 3 questions are what Apple calls the app definition statement. And they include it in their HIG, their Human Interface Guidelines. And so whether you're an Apple developer or not, you can read these Human Interface Guidelines. It's a lot about developing software and thinking in terms of the user. So you think, well, what features does my app have to have? What's my flashlight going to be like? And so I'm going to brainstorm. I'm going to This American Life it and get tons and tons and tons of ideas. And then I'm going to focus on who my app is for. And not just generally. I'm not going to think my app is for anybody with a credit card. I'm going to be very specific, because my flashlight is going to be different from your flashlight if I'm focusing on who my audience is. So I might be building it for my daughters. That's Maggie and Elena. There's my flashlight. So I used to work in radio, audio too, not just news, and not a radio that was this old. I was no This American Life, but one thing I had to do is I had to address a microphone. I had to talk into a microphone to reach thousands of people. And it was a real transition for me as I got better at it. Because when you first start out in radio and they tell you you've got 40,000 people listening right now, you think that you're talking to this. You think you're talking to a whole room full of people. Where really, you're talking to one person. Because that's how people listen to you. They listen very individually. So I might be talking to 10,000 people, but they're listening 1 or 2 people at a time. In their car, in their living room, in their headphones. It's a very personal experience. And that changes the conversation. So my friend Chuck Collins says about it. He says, when they're listening on their iPhone or their Android device, you are literally the voice in their head. That's how you're interacting with them. You're not talking like this. You're not talking over loudspeakers. So here is Howie Chiswick, a stadium announcer, and here's
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Welcome to Gund Arena for today's Cavalier basketball game. Elo Farfari!
Can you imagine talking intimately to somebody that way? So I was recently in San Francisco, and here's the Giants announcer, their baseball team, calling a play. He again is reaching just as many people as Howie Chiswick, but he's reaching them over the radio, and he sounds like he's talking to you like I'm talking to you now, only even more intimately. And so this is John Miller.
And it will bring up Brandon Crawford. Left-handed batter, and ball 1 to him, down and away. Crawford is hitting .283, a homer and 8 driven in, but he's hitting .444 against left-handed pitching. So he happens to have a lefty out there right now.
I mean, it's like he's just talking to you. This is Betty White. Betty White had TV shows that had millions of viewers. And they asked her about it. What was her secret to it? She said, well, I have small audiences. And they said, small audiences? You're nuts. Some of your shows had 30 million viewers. And she said, yeah, but I don't talk to all 30 million. I talk to 2 or 3 at a time. And now that they have Netflix or whatever they're watching on, I talk to 1 at a time. So when you think of where your app is, if you're writing a desktop app you're at some distance from, but it's still pretty close. It's just something that you're working on. If you got a laptop, then you're interacting with the keyboard and the trackpad perhaps, and it's a little closer to you. But when you're dealing on the phone, it's a very intimate experience. It doesn't seem like such a leap because we're used to it now, but it's so different controlling with a mouse or a trackpad than touching the actual screen that we're interacting with. So if you think of where your iOS app is or your Android app is, it's here. Right? It's here. It's very intimate. How people interact with you is this. It's not speakers. So you've got to think in terms of what you produce. Even if you produce it for a laptop, you're communicating with one person at a time. And so your features have to reach that person, and so you have to know who that person is. Right? You have to really think about it. And once you've thought about who you're building it for, you have to focus. You have to throw stuff out. You're building it for many people. So when you think of who your app is for, you're very specific. This is my daughter Maggie interacting with a cat. You need to know she's allergic to cats. Is your app that compelling that someone who's allergic to it or not even suited for it is willing to lay down with it? That's a big challenge. So narrow the features, think about your audience, and build it specifically for them. So when I write a book, this was one of my Cocoa books I wrote, I had a very specific focus. I thought, I'm not writing this for a new programmer, so I don't have to teach ifs and fors. I'm teaching it for someone who knows Java or a C-style language. I'm just going to teach them what's different about my language. And it helps you focus. Every book I sit down to write, who am I writing it for? What's different about it? Once you narrow your features, then you're going to reach that one person, and that means you're going to reach many people. If you talk to 1,000 people, you're not going to reach any of them. If you talk to one person, you're going to reach a ton of people. Well, here's a sad story. I have a friend named Patrick Burleson who tweeted about a year ago about having to buy a new phone. Doesn't seem very smart using your iPhone as a flashlight to see down the clogged drain, especially I'm not building my flashlight for Patrick. I'm going to narrow my audience. I'm going to figure out what the features are. I'm building it for them. It's not for everyone. Not everyone's going to be delighted. This is probably my favorite picture of my kids. I was away one year on Father's Day, and my wife tried to take pictures of the kids, sending me this happy Father's Day picture. And Maggie is quite a bit taller than Elena, so when they stood side by side, Elena was unhappy. So Elena got up on the stairs, and then Maggie was unhappy, so she got on a higher stair. And in this one, you can see that Elena has crawled up on a chair, and Maggie's not very happy. And finally, my wife took the picture, and she said, you know what? That's who they are today. Not everyone is going to be delighted. Focus on the people you're trying to reach. Focus positively. So we heard yesterday about this positive psychology. I can't make everybody happy. I'm going to make these single people happy. I'm going to focus. I'm going to know what I'm building, for whom, and why. So in my case, I am building a flashlight app so that my children can see at night. I'm not building an app so that Patrick can clear drains. Okay? I'm building my app for them. One person. Not Patrick. Okay. So once we know who we're creating our apps for, we can think a little broadly. This is my favorite Apple ad, and this is a version of it with Steve Jobs narrating that was released again after he died.
Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them. About the only thing you can't do is ignore them, because they change things. They push the human race forward. While some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius. Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do.
Back when the Apple logo had colors. I gotta tell you, Apple ads make me cry. They do, they move me. They're talking to a person. They're motivating me in ways that I hope we can motivate others as we build products. Let's see. He talked about genius. Turns out there are lines missing from that ad. They had several different versions of the ad, and some were for print and some were longer versions of the television ad. And so after he says about the only thing you can't do is ignore them, he says, because they change things. They invent, they imagine, they heal, they explore, they create, they inspire, they push the human race forward. Maybe they have to be crazy. Because how else can you stare at an empty canvas and see a work of art? Or sit in silence and hear a song that hasn't been written? We make tools for these kinds of people. We're the tool makers. They're the geniuses. And before you find that upsetting, I'm going to tell you, being a tool maker is awesome. Think of the things that we enable. When you make a tool that lets a genius be a genius, oh my gosh, not only do you change the world for them, but then they turn around and change the world for the rest of us. And then there's the unintended talking to one person, reaching many. When you make that tool for the geniuses, others use it, and they do amazing things with it. Most of us aren't geniuses. Patrick's saga continues. What's sad is, not only has he tweeted about his iPhone being ruined and his Retina MacBook Pro being ruined, but it turns out he's tweeted about other devices he's ruined since then. So we want to go change the world. Well, Patrick recently has taken a job at Apple. And people were not kind. So change the world. Well, that comes right from that ad. The people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do. So is that our charge? Is that our goal? I don't want you to change the world. It's hard. You can't. Don't change the whole world anyway. So if we're not going to change the world, what should we do? So my request, I guess, is that you change the world just for one person, just like in radio. Just change that world for one person and others will be changed as well. So that's my goal. I'd like you to just change the world for one person. So I grew up in a very small town. My dad taught teachers, and so a lot of those teachers would end up in our house. And one of them was Glenn Lohman. And Glenn Lohman died about a year ago. And at his memorial, he taught 5th, 6th, 7th grade girls science. As a memorial, a lot of the girls told his favorite stories again. And one of his favorite stories, which you might have heard, is about the starfish on the beach after a storm. And they've been washed onto the beach, and there's a guy walking down the beach, and every once in a while he bends over and he grabs a starfish and he throws it in the water. And as he's doing it, this old man is watching him come closer and closer and closer. And finally the old man says, "What are you doing? There's thousands of starfish. You can't save all of them." The guy says, "I know, but I saved that one." Another teacher that used to hang out was a math teacher named Rudd Crawford. And Rudd Crawford had this blade of grass theory. Rudd was a really good math teacher. And what happens with really good math teachers near me is the administration takes them out of the classroom and says, "We're going to put you in charge of other teachers." And he said, "No, thanks. I do my work in the classroom. I can't change a whole field of grass. Each semester, I can touch one child and change their world. And when I change that one child, I've done way more than if you put me in the administration and you don't let me teach." So I don't know if you know who Monty Hall is. Monty Hall hosted the Let's Make a Deal show for a long time, and he was recently on Mark Maron's podcast, and he told this story of when he was young. His family was very poor, and he couldn't afford to stay in college. And so he went back to his dad's butcher shop, and he was sweeping floors, and he was running deliveries, and this guy called him over, and the guy was only 22, 23 years old, and he says, "What are you doing here? You're brilliant. Why aren't you in college?" "I don't have money." And the guy said, "I will pay for your college, but you can't tell anyone I did it, and you got to get at least B pluses because I'm not wasting my money." And so recently the guy died and gave Monty the permission to tell the story after he died, and Monty said since then, he made a bunch of money in TV. He's got foundations that give millions of dollars away to people. That one guy, by changing his life, he was able to turn around and change many lives. So when you think it's overwhelming, it's not. Just focus. What's that one difference you want to make? And think about those questions. What are you building? For whom are you building it? And why? Now it's hard, right? If changing the world was easy, man, I wouldn't want to see the results. There are subtleties. Like if you've ever been to a show and noticed the lights, then they're doing the lights wrong. You know, if someone's really doing a good job at running the stage lighting, you don't even notice them. Little things in hotel rooms, like recently they've started putting a bend in the rod so that the sheet doesn't hang against you when you're taking a shower. Little touches. In your app, if you check a box in Xcode, then you get an email text field, and the @ sign and the dot are on the same page as all the letters. And when you hold down the dot, you get the .com, you get all those. Little touches. Your users won't know why they hate your app, but they will. They'll give you those low reviews, and they won't know why. You've got to do ridiculous amounts of work. So when I was in college, we listened to rock radio. This guy was not in rock radio. And we went down to this one station that 13% of Boston was listening to this show in the morning. And they were our heroes. We wanted to do that. And their studio was here, and this guy's studio was here. And this guy had 12% of Boston listening to him. And he had 12% of Boston listening to him for a long time. He'd done mornings for this long. And the rock station had gone from 2% to 13%, and then back down to doesn't even exist anymore. And he kept rolling along with 12%. And people didn't even know he was on the air because he said, "My job is to get you from the weather to the sports. You don't even notice me on the way. From sports back into music, from music into commercials." He looked at himself as just that nice transition. And that nice transition did tremendous work for 40-some years. And those of us that were kids wanting to get into radio, we didn't even notice him. We noticed the guys playing the music that we liked. So I don't know if you know who this is over here. He annoys me. This is James Lipton, and he has a show where he interviews celebrities. But I got to show you why I respect him, as annoying as he is. Here he is interviewing Brad Pitt. It's a 1-hour interview. Do you see all those note cards in front of him? That's for a 1-hour interview. He doesn't say to Brad Pitt, "Where are you from?" He knows. And he says it quickly, and then he asks a deep question about it. And if Brad takes him in another direction, I don't know if you can see it, but those notes are clipped together, and he just flips down and goes to that section. He's prepared for wherever the interview goes. He's done the work. This is a guy named Elvis Mitchell. Elvis Mitchell does a lot of movie interviews, and he interviews producers and directors and actors, and at least once a show, the person he's interviewing with, he says, "Well, you know what I like about your work? It's this." And the person he's interviewing says, "I never noticed that about my own work. I never knew I was this." It's amazing. So you do all that work, and then from This American Life, you throw a lot of it away. I know we're taught that as developers, right? Build one to throw away. We don't do that. So I don't even know what's on this pizza. I think there's eggs and anchovies and olives, and there's no cohesiveness to it. This pizza, simple. It's tomato, cheese, and basil. Just a simple, basic pizza. Now, simple isn't always good. But focus is, knowing what we do. Alec Baldwin recently interviewed Stacy Keach, and Stacy Keach has done a lot of Shakespearean acting over his time. He said, "You've acted in a lot of Shakespearean performances over your time. How many times have you really nailed it? How many times have you had just a great performance?" And Keach said, in 40, 50 years, maybe 3 times. Because sometimes during his performance, he loses focus, and the moment he does, the audience feels it. They don't know what it is. He's still saying the words, but something's different. You know? Something's different. You lose focus, and your audience knows it. I have a friend who I won't name, who has a beautiful voice. I worked with him in radio, but his mind is always wandering. So you think he's talking to you, and the next thing you know, he shifts over there. So you run over there so he's talking to you again, and it's very hard. Focus is very hard. But what you build, whether you know it or not, what you build has you all over it. There are little decisions that you make that make your app different than my app. You make these choices. You have constraints. I only have time to do this, not that. And that brings us back to the Let's Make a Deal show. What was so different about Let's Make a Deal from other game shows of its time was contestants had to give up what they had in order to take a chance. Up till then it was, you've earned this much, do you want to go for more? Sure. In Let's Make a Deal, you've earned this much, you have this, do you want to risk it, throw it away for what might be behind that next door? And that was different. But that's how we live as developers. When we decide how we're going to spend our next week, the things we choose to do are also telling us the things that we don't have time to do. We don't have resources. Now, you're not alone. If you run out of hands, someone will hold the microphone for you. You've got help. It's really hard for us as developers to accept help. It's all around us. What you build is yours. There's you all over it. So, my senior year of college, I wanted to go into radio. I wanted to be a DJ. And all over the Boston area, there's a ton of radio stations. So I got my first job in radio the year after college, and I'm teaching high school during the day in Newton, Massachusetts, and I'm driving an hour and a half to the southern tip of Rhode Island to do radio because I'm young and I'm stupid. And I'm passing by the radio stations, and about halfway down, I can start to hear the station, and I'm really nervous. It's my first time working in professional radio, and this is going to be different. And the woman who's on before me goes into a commercial break, and she plays the wrong commercial. And she forgets that her microphone is on, and she says, And then she hears herself say that, and she says, and I think, wow, there's nothing I can do as bad as that. And it took me years to realize that she'd had a genuine moment that people never forgot. I mean, it's more than 30 years later, and I still remember that clear as day. And it took me a lot longer to become genuine and be myself. In your software, you've got to be you. I listen to a lot of podcasts, and the Nerdist Writers Panel recently interviewed a bunch of actors, and they said, if you think about it, it's easier than it's ever been to make a movie. Maybe not a Hollywood movie that gets distributed, but the equipment is reasonable. We've got these cameras all over. We can produce things. You can get your friends together and make a movie easily. I can do radio in my house. What I used to need a whole studio for, I now do podcasts that I produce on my Mac. Just very easy now. And it's true for us writing software. You think of it, people write IDEs that are free. They used to be really expensive. You used to have to pay for compilers. You used to have to pay for computer time. Now, not only do they provide the tools for us, they provide the store for us to sell it in. It is so much easier for us to be a software developer now than it's ever been. But you got to know who you are. And you have to know who your audience is. So, when I was in Cleveland radio, I worked after the newscast as a morning man, and we had a bit, I was working under the name of Fudge, and every day we would do a fortune cookie that said what the day was going to be like, and we'd call it Fudge's Fortune Cookie. Give you a little word of advice about the day, and then we would give the day a rating, and I'd call it the Fudge Factor. And it'd be a number on a scale of 1 to 10 telling you how good a day you're going to have. And because I'd been a high school math teacher, I picked it randomly. And about the third day in, a guy called me up, and he said something that was really interesting. He said, I know that you make that number up, but when you give today a 4, I don't want to leave my house. Don't ever choose a number less than 6. And I thought about that, and we ran this bit for 2 years, and I never chose a number less than 7, and people never noticed. And people would call. One day we forgot the bit. What kind of day am I going to have? What color should I wear? I'm making it up. Your app is not about you, but you are all over your app. There's a guy named David Smith who runs a show called Developing Perspective, and his word for this that I just love is opinionation. It's you making these choices. Your opinions are all over your app. I mean, if you look at a book on calculus, they're all the same. If you want to write a book on calculus, you buy 8 other books on calculus and you open them up and you go, I'll do related rates now. They're horrible. What you do is you. And if you look at the Apple ads don't tell you it's this many gigs, this many megs, this much whatever. What they do is they say, here's what people can do with Apple products. It's not about the products themselves, it's about what you can do with them. Now, these two guys used to do a movie review. Unfortunately, they're both dead now. Siskel and Ebert, and they were invited by Apple one year to review Apple's commercials for the year. And Gene Siskel, the guy on the right, kept saying, Apple doesn't mention their name enough. They're basically writing ads for any computer. And Ebert said, yes, that's the point. It's what people can do. It's not about the products. If you look at Apple's ads, it says, everyday people can do this. They listen to music, they take and share pictures, they talk face to face. So when you talk about your app, think about what it enables in other people. Don't think about, hey, my app is this % faster. It's, well, because it's this % faster, what is it that people can do? Well, how does it change your life? So before last year's WWDC, which is Apple's developer conference, they ran this video. Think about what you want to do. What's the mark you want to make? Here's another radio story. I think it's the last one. I got fired in radio, and I called a friend of mine, and he said, "Oh, you haven't worked in radio too. You've been fired 3 times. Call me when you've been fired 3 times." So a year later, I called him. And the oddest thing happened. I'm in the workout club, and I'm getting dressed and getting ready to go, and someone turned to me and said, "Didn't you used to be Dan Steinberg?" You are part of your work. No matter what you do, people know you as part of your work. So this is an iMac. And Apple has a really strong idea of what they're building, for whom they're building it, and why. And so although this is more modern marketing, I got to tell you, there was a Macworld years ago where I just had a feeling. I usually get feelings before Apple conferences of what's coming. I can't tell you why, just if you watch them long enough, you kind of get a feeling. And I thought, they're going to come out with the Intel iMac, but just in case, I went out and bought the PowerPC iMac, and I put it at home in the box, and I said to my kids and my wife, don't open it till we know if the new one's coming, but if the new one's not coming, you can open this. And I got to Macworld, and sure enough, Apple introduced the new Intel. And my kids cried. Because their games wouldn't run on it. Yes, there was a compatibility mode, but, I mean, they were 6 and 8. They had stuff to do. So you can see here, Apple isn't saying, we've got a camera. And they aren't saying we have software. They're saying, look at this. This is what we enable. Now we enable FaceTime. In those days, picture taking, movies. So the kids opened the iMac while I was gone. They took pictures and stuff. And so you ask, is it worth it? And the answer is yes. It's my daughter Maggie. Maggie graduates from high school on Thursday. I'm going back tomorrow so I can be there for her graduation. It's one of my most recent pictures of Maggie. The picture you just saw was the last picture I have of Elena. Elena died the next day, suddenly. What she died of, the details, not important. The important thing is, weeks went by, we're sitting around the kitchen table, and my wife, because you bring these things up when these things happen, says, oh, she lost her tooth the night before she died. I don't have a picture of her without her tooth. And Maggie said, oh, I do. And she showed us that picture. And then she showed us 2 months of movies and pictures of Elena's last months on Earth that she and her 8-year-old sister were able to take. An 8-year-old and a 6-year-old by themselves. What you do matters. What you do changes lives. We're tool makers.
We have a long way to go and a lot to learn. But now, more than ever, we will work to leave the world better than we found it and make the tools that inspire others to do the same.
That's Tim Cook, who runs Apple now, a recent ad just about ecology and what they're thinking about now. So here's what I want to leave you with. I'd like you to change the world for one person, even Patrick. Thank you.